Today, I'm joined by Ioana. She's the entrepreneur and the founder of Comuna Project. Ioana, thank you for coming on the pod. How's it going?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
Great. Usually, this is the part of the podcast where I ask people where they're located right now. Obviously, we're friends, so I know you're in Montreal.
Yeah.
But for those people who don't know you, can you tell us a bit about your background?
Yeah. So I'm in Montreal right now, where I'm currently grounded for the last year, mostly. My background as in cultural or
Yeah, cultural, because you're mixed. There's a lot of things happening. So like where did you grow up before coming to Montreal?
So I was born in Romania, and at 5 years old, I immigrated to Canada with my parents and my sister. And I grew up in northern BC in a town called Prince George. That's a forestry, lumber, pulp mill industry town. We settled there because before we immigrated, my dad was, and from the early 90s, was sort of like a seasonal worker in the forestry industry. And one of the main reasons why we left Romania right in the early 90s after communism fell was as a result of the socioeconomic condition there. It was in a state of collapse, essentially economic collapse after communism fell, and political chaos as well. And I needed medical attention that we couldn't receive there. And there was one MRI in the country and it wasn't working. And I needed an MRI in order to get an operation. And doctors there kind of like knew what was needed, but didn't have the infrastructure available to be able to do that. So because Canada at the time was very friendly to immigration from former Eastern Bloc communist countries in the Soviet Union, my dad was able to sponsor us because he had been in Canada for 5 years at that point. It was 1995. To sponsor us kind of on like emergency, like family reunification type grounds. I don't know exactly what it was under, but yeah, so within like a few months, we left Romania and came to Canada, and that's where I grew up, was Prince George, northern BC.
Nice. And what were your fondest memories of Prince George of BC?
It was an amazing place to grow up, because it's surrounded by wilderness, and because my dad worked in forestry, some of my like earliest and most like cherished memories are in nature. It's surrounded by pine forests and like numerous lakes. And when I was much smaller, we would sometimes go. He would do like contracts, like it was silviculture, the industry that he worked in. And he would do contracts in the spring and summer and fall time. So I have some memories when, like shortly after we immigrated, of being like out in the forest in his trailer with my mom and my sisters and exploring like areas. I think that if I remember correctly, obviously I was very young, but like around like the Fraser Canyon and just like these really beautiful areas. And because like my family, the part of Romania that we come from is the northeastern Carpathian. So my parents were like the first out of the generation from their background, from their families that left the village. So they were born as part from peasant backgrounds. And they also both have this very strong connection to being in nature. And I remember like going to parks and kind of like wilderness forest reserves with my mom all the time on hikes and walks, and like foraging a lot with her, like mushroom foraging and Saskatoon berry foraging. So definitely like in nature are some of my fondest memories. And it's a small town too. So I grew up basically like without having to ever lock our doors and staying out really late and playing, like in my schoolyard, which backed onto like a large forest in the neighborhood that I grew up in, which was in the center of the town. But it kind of was like a bowl, and then from the like inner part of the city, it went up, and then there's like this huge forest reserve called Forest for the World, which is like connected to the university and had a forestry program. So yeah, the wilderness.
I mean, I read I saw a map the other day of the most desirable provinces to live in Canada, ranked by Canadians, and BC was by far the top one. And then just listening to you right now, I'm just thinking about that and like, oh my God, I want to go now.
Yeah. Now I took it for granted, for sure. And now, obviously, as always happens, I appreciate so much that is where I got to grow up and become an adolescent. And I left at 17 because I was like, I need to get out of here. I need to like see the world and spread my wings. But yeah, it's definitely a place that like really now I see was like very like animating force behind a lot of like who I am, like what I do and everything, because of that connection to nature and proximity to it too.
Mm-hmm. And back then, would you visit Romania a lot while you were living in BC, or like did you go see family every now and then during that time frame?
Yeah, and not at the very beginning. It was a couple years because mostly like financial. Before we were able to go back to Romania. The first time that I went back, I was in grade 3 for a month over spring break, and then I went back again, I think when I was like 11 or 12 years old. And after that, it became sort of like a very regular occurrence every other year throughout high school. I'm very, very lucky that I was able to spend a lot of my summers in my adolescence in Romania. And I would mostly be going back to my grandparents' villages where my parents were born and where they grew up and where my grandparents still are and where a lot of my family still is, or like the cities just outside of it where I also have family. So I'm very fortunate that was a big part of my life, was this in between these two very different places and very different cultures. And it definitely influences very like cross-cultural identity that at times was very confusing and was difficult to sort of like constantly be kind of like a bridge between these two cultures within like my own family and within my group of friends. And that, like when summertime, when kids are like free and that's when you make most of your memories together. I usually wasn't here or wasn't in Canada. I would be back in Romania and then come back at the end of summer to start the school year again.
And I think you went to Romania this past year during the pandemic to see your dad and some of your family. What was it like? Like I read it in the news about what's the day-to-day in the US and Canada and European countries, but what was it like in Romania being there?
Good question. It was yeah, in some ways it was very different. When I left Montreal, the reason that I went was out of this like kind of like an intuitive calling to go. And it was when Montreal was like at the end of summer and it was still a little bit open. There weren't very much restrictions, and Canada was still on the safe list for European Union countries, which meant that there was no restrictions on Canadian passport holders. And so it felt like an opportunity that I should take. And I kind of felt that there was more restrictions coming at that point. So I went, and I was supposed to stay for 3 months, but I ended up staying for 2 months. And once I got there it was quite open as well. So there was like a little bit of time at the beginning that was like quite free with movement. But even then, restrictions started to become put in place there as well, like quite aggressively with lockdowns and curfews and everything. So I spent all of my time, which was the first time actually in my life, even from when I used to go back in high school and more recently, that I only spent my time between my dad's house, and he lives in the southern part of the country in an area called Dobroja near the Black Sea, and my grandparents' villages in the northeastern Carpathians in the region called Moldova, which is the region of northeastern Romania, not the country. And I would spend like 10 to 12, 14 days up in the villages, and then come back down to my dad's. But the reason that I came home early was because lockdown measures were getting quite intense there, and I was a little bit worried that I would get stuck or that flights would start getting canceled again, so I came home a little bit earlier. But it was very different in that when I came home, when I came back to Montreal, it was kind of like I didn't realize how much I was absorbing in the like anxiousness of being in that environment at this time, because of like the increased restrictions. And well, now we're in a curfew in Montreal, but at the time, that was the first time I had experienced that. And when I came back to Montreal, there was this like big sigh of relief, and even like entering the airport, and when I took the Uber back home to start my quarantine, I remember looking out of my Uber window and was like, why isn't anybody on the street wearing masks? Because there had been a month period already where if you, at this moment you left your house or your car, you had to have a mask on.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it was such a, like, put things into perspective of, even though it's a global situation that we're experiencing, it's very different in different places depending on like the infrastructure available. It's a country where, even though it's been developing a lot since it entered the European Union, it's very plagued by corruption, which is very sad. And that means that a lot of its institutions, and especially their healthcare and hospitals, we're already in a place where it's been the brain drain of doctors for decades, and the infrastructure has not been updated.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, very different experience in that end.
Thanks for sharing that. So before we sort of touched on the subject of Comuna and travel and how that came to be, I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about your time in university. Like, you know, at that stage of your life, I don't think travel was something you thought you'd have a career in. What did you think? Like, what were you heading towards at that time period of your life?
Yeah. So I studied where should I start? Right when I entered college, or right after high school, I moved away from Prince George and I moved to Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
In my mind, I had the plan to go into nursing. My mom's a nurse. And in that first trajectory, I thought I would, become a nurse practitioner and do Doctors Without Borders, or like, Nurses Without Borders kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did a year of sciences and was like, oh no, I'm not very good at this. This is not for me. And I guess it was kind of a moment. I was reading a lot. I've always loved history, and decided to switch into social sciences. And then I did a year of social sciences and transferred to Carleton in Ottawa for international relations and political economy, which is what I graduated from my undergrad in. And I thought at the time that I would continue on and do a master's probably somewhere in Europe. And I also wanted to go to law school and become a lawyer, possibly an immigration lawyer or human rights. None of that happened. But there was always kind of like this wanting to see and experience the world. It's definitely, it has always been a big part of me. I think since the moment that I got on that airplane at 4.5 years old, on my way to Canada, and and even like my early childhood experience of like going between Romania and coming back. And when I would go to Romania, kind of travel around Europe when family had emigrated to other parts of Europe, definitely influenced me a lot. Mm. And so I wanted to work somehow internationally, but I thought it was going to be in like international development or for like a big organization was like were my dreams. I didn't ever think in my mind that I would start a travel company and work in the travel industry.
Well, you mentioned human rights lawyer. I know you didn't end up being that, but you did go, I think, at one point to Greece and volunteer at a refugee camp.
Yeah.
What year was this?
That was in March 2016.
Okay, and what was that like?
It was, there isn't one word that I can say for that. It was intense and eye-opening and heartbreaking and beautiful and every possible experience, like emotional experience that you can think of. I was there for 2 weeks, and that was a result of, right, so while I was in university my last year, I started doing like creative consulting, mostly in social media with businesses, and it kind of ended up being, I don't know, that's just where the path took me. I started working in real estate, with real estate development, and doing more like digital consulting, marketing type work. And after a couple of years of that, I went to that because it was something more creative, and I felt a creative void in my life right after university, something super academic, like writing 20-page papers every single week. And I also felt like I needed a bit of a break before deciding whether I would continue on with academia or not. So that's what led me to that. But during that time, before I went on this volunteer trip to Greece, it was during the refugee crisis that I just kind of started in around 2015. With the Syrian refugee crisis, and I was consuming a lot of news all the time, even like obviously because I was used to studying international relations, like being very up to date on like international affairs and current affairs and what's going on in the world. So that was a big part of like the content that I was seeing was just like what was going on in the world, and it sparked in me this sort of like sense of despair and angst that I wasn't quite sure where it was coming from, in a big sense of like a disconnection from myself and the world around me, not just the greater world, but also like my immediate world around me, like my environment. And from that, I started volunteering with a refugee organization called Refugee 613. Just like nothing like super involved, but I did reach out to them and asked how I can get involved in some ways, and started doing like design for them pro bono and things like that, because that's what I was doing through my consulting studio. And that gave me the sense of like, okay, I feel like I'm like, more connected to like something that I care about and that I'm passionate about, that I, did get drawn to academically, but still through that kept feeling very disconnected. And this opportunity came up to join a group to go to Greece during that time, during March, when there was a lot of refugees crossing the sea from Turkey to the island of Lesbos. So that is where I went on that trip. That's where we landed, was the island of Lesbos in Greece. And it was really intense, the exact timing of when I arrived there, because there had been volunteers and, like Doctors Without Borders, United Nations, everything there for months at that point, if you remember, like on the news, seeing a lot of this imagery and everything. And we arrived, I think, like mid-March, and that was when essentially all of the borders in Europe closed down, was right when we arrived there, which meant that, and it was also when the European Union cut this deal with Turkey to send refugees back to Turkey. So it basically meant that, I think at the time, like over 30,000 refugees got blocked in Greece, and many of them are still there in refugee camps today. And from there, we came back to Athens, into the port of Piraeus. And that's where like it kind of turned into another like makeshift refugee camp, because so many people were all of a sudden stranded. They could no longer continue on their route to their destination that they were hoping to, a lot of them in Western Europe and Austria. in Germany to reunite with family. They're like husbands or sisters or brothers and sons who had made it earlier. Many were, trying to navigate through Europe to reach their families.
Mm-hmm.
And the countries that first closed their borders were more of the Eastern European countries.
Mm.
Macedonia on the border of northern Greece, Hungary, and they were just transit cities. Like, from being there and talking to people and hearing people's stories and frustrations, like, nobody wanted to stay in those countries because they knew that it was not friendly for refugees or for migrants to stay. So they close their borders anyways to not allow that traffic to go through for several reasons, but a lot of it because now we see since then that a lot of those governments have become very populist and right-wing and very anti-immigration and anti-refugee.
Yeah.
So that's how and why I ended up doing this volunteer trip to Greece during that time.
Yeah, and it's great to hear sort of like your experience on the ground of what it is, because it's not at all what we like see or hear that is portrayed in the media. I vividly recall that image of that young boy on the beach that really made the rounds, and I think that came in even later. And so it's just like there's that disconnect, and it's something that is quite it happens day in day, like throughout a lot of topics, and especially in travel, where you have a sort of idea of what a destination is like, but really when you experience it, it's something different completely.
Yeah, it's that you brought up that little boy on the beach. Alain Kurdi is his name, and that was the image that I saw. It was August 2015.
Okay, so it was before.
Yeah, it was just slightly before, and that was like a big, like, kind of like, I don't know, light bulb moment or like trigger in me that was sort of like a bit of like a wake up to the reality that was going on. And I was in Turkey at the time. I was in Istanbul, and it was kind of like the first solo trip that I've ever taken to a place where I didn't know anybody else. And it was on my flight home that I saw it on my phone, the article come up with that image, and it just like it stuck with me. And then when I came home, kept seeing more and more of it, because that was the image that sparked international awareness of what's going on. Obviously, like the crisis in Syria and the war started much before that, and that is what then led me to start volunteering with that refugee 613 in Ottawa, of just feeling like needing to get involved in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But
cool. Not to change the subject, but
brought up kind of like the reality of like media and what was being portrayed. So that was a big realization when I was in Greece of being there and seeing what multiple media outlets across the spectrum, across different countries, because they were all there, journalists, and would come up to you, or I'd see them go up to other people. And it was really eye-opening that like they were already going there with the story that they wanted to tell.
Yeah.
And exactly. And it didn't matter like what you told them or, what the reality was. Like they were kind of just picking up pieces to like complete their story.
Right. And
so it was very frustrating seeing the reality, which was not something that was being portrayed. And also that like, I was there, I wouldn't say that I did like a lot. It was distributing clean and warm clothing and food most of the time. The most impactful part was actually like listening to people's stories and how important that was for people to like just be listened to and have the ability to share, like a group of young boys who had essentially like almost like walked all the way from Afghanistan and ended up and to like the shores of Izmir in Turkey through like the mountains and everything, just to escaping being recruited by the Taliban, or
That's incredible.
Yeah, a lot of Afghan refugees actually at the time. A lot of the focus was on Syrian refugees, but a lot of Afghan refugees as well. Many of them young boys or young men who had worked with the U.S. military at the time, and now them and their families were being targeted for having done that. Now that the U.S. had pulled out, just so many people that realized being there were just like you, like this. You could be that person, and like seeing yourself in that person's shoes. But then what you were seeing on the media was like chaos and despair, and being there, it was not chaos and despair at all. I mean, in some ways, but like it was human life and human experience. And most of the moments were actually quite beautiful, and a lot of moments of like very deep human connection with people that many of them I'm still in touch with today.
Wow. And I'm happy you brought up that sort of like the media has those preconceived narratives, and sometimes they'll go and try to fetch imagery or storylines that fit that. And, correct me if I'm wrong, but like a year later, maybe in 2017, I think you end up going to Havana and have a similar experience.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I was working still in the creative industries, but at this point I started working with like a different agency as a digital project manager. And I ended up in Havana on a very like spontaneous trip. I was in Miami at the time for a real estate conference with my partner at the time who was working in real estate. So I went with him just to check out Miami, and I think it just was like, we didn't really plan this trip at all, which is kind of like, which is not something that was normal for me. Like I like to at least like plan some sort of structure to know the place that I'm going into, like cool neighborhoods and stuff. But we didn't really do that for this because it was more of a business trip. And we just didn't really love Miami very much, to be honest. We were so close to Cuba and Havana, and we were like, okay, we're so close, like let's go. And at the time, it was when Obama was still in office, and travel had just opened up, and there was like flights from US cities to Havana. So we went to Havana, and again, like had nothing planned other than an Airbnb booked in central Havana, and were dropped in Havana with no idea of like where we were or where we were going, and then got there and realized like, oh, you can't just turn on Google here and like search like the nearest restaurant, and you like, because the only place to get internet was in these like Wi-Fi hotspots throughout the city, and you had to like get a card to connect, like very minimal access and super old school that way. So we started walking around Havana to like check it out, and instantly could just like feel how we were being like pulled and gravitated by this like invisible strange force into like what was clearly like a tourist hotspot like circuit. And that I think it was like the first like 8 to 10 hours that we were there, I could feel it like that we were in that, and what we were experiencing was kind of this like amusement park type of environment of Havana, and knowing that, but having zero idea how to like get out of it, how to like see, okay, but like where do people really live? Like what is the actual reality? Because that's the type of travel that I was always used to, like a much more local experience, and like getting to know people, or like I would spend a time beforehand in like my personal travels looking for like kind of like obscure local blogs to like get a sense of like the local culture and underground music scenes and arts and things like that. Did not clearly have that available there. And there was that evening, or maybe I don't recall exactly anymore. We were only there for 3 or 4 days. That evening or the next evening, we were walking around and heard like good music coming from a rooftop, and looked up and was like, oh, that place looks kind of cool and like sort of hidden. So we like found the door that like led you up, and it was this like super hip, very like cool vibe place, and full of like locals, but also people who were travelers. But you can tell all of a sudden like, oh, this is different from like all the places on the street that every single one of them are playing Buena Vista Social Club, and, you know? So then we sat down, and we happened to sit down beside this couple, and my partner and I were just like talking, or had ordered some drinks, and we started talking to them. I think either they asked us where we were from or vice versa. And yeah, they were, after a while of just kind of chatting. So the man was Cuban, and she was Norwegian, but had been located in Havana for many years, so she was living there. Mm-hmm. And they were like, like, I really wish that like more travelers and more tourists that come here like would take the opportunity to just talk to locals and not be so afraid of like having a conversation, because like, you being here in this place and like having this conversation with us, like now we can share with you like all of these cool things that are happening in Havana. There's like an incredible music scene, like incredible art scene. There's something going on, like a concert, this or that every single day. But like the experience that tourists are getting basically like down there or like out there is not like the real Havana right now. And that interaction and that experience sort of like then shifted and changed the remainder of our time there, which was really short. But that night when we left and walked back to our Airbnb, I was just like, I just started thinking about that, about like, for the first time ever, because this was really the first time that I had experienced a super mass tourism type experience of being a traveler and a tourist. And it was kind of eye-opening to me to realize that, I don't think the way that I've been traveling is how most people travel, or it's not that normal. Having kind of just had this like duality experience all at once in Havana then. And I just kept thinking about that, about like the role of the travel industry, about how mass tourism kind of like, sort of like sets its own agenda a little bit of like how they want to control the tourist experience and the narrative and everything, because it's safe. It's safe that way. You know what to expect. They know what to expect of the tourist, and they keep you in this like, literally, it's like a circuit.
Yeah. Like a bubble. Yeah, bubble.
And it's very hard to get out of it because you need to have a certain level of like confidence to step outside of your comfort zone to do that. And when everything is curated, for you to not have to do that, it's difficult to step outside of it.
I'm totally biased because like everything you said is exactly the way I want to travel, and the sort of, what I have in my mind of Cuba is just a lot of people going to their bubbles and these all-inclusives, and then they do that one day trip to Havana, and then maybe another day trip to a UNESCO site, but they're still in their bubble, and they don't mingle. And you're totally right. Like it's, there's something that's lost there, an opportunity in a way.
Yeah, and for Havana and Cuba specifically, like that's how the travel industry, or the tourism industry, was specifically and intentionally created as well by the government when after the special period in the 90s, after the Soviet Union pulled out and they lost all of their economic support essentially internationally, and there was the embargo as well. So Cuba went through an extremely difficult period in the 90s called the special period. And as a way for the government to bring in money and resources into the country, they opened up tourism. But did that, and that's why you have the all-inclusive resorts, Veradero, all of them were created and built to bring tourism in, but to keep tourists from other countries in a specific part where like they could still control it. And for a long time, Cubans were not even allowed to interact with tourists. So that is how it was started and created, and that you can see how it's still influencing the current reality, because that's what it's grown from. And then obviously like other companies have come in and partnered with the government, like large mass tourism companies and such, and they've sort of they've maintained that structure a little bit, actually a lot.
And so after this trip, you fly back to Ottawa, or I guess you go back to Miami and then Ottawa. And I guess that was kind of your like aha moment, like maybe there's something here. Maybe I want to create like a travel company, or
yeah.
Like, was it like an idea that took hold of you and you're like, you couldn't not think about it basically?
Kind of. It was something in general that I just couldn't stop thinking about, was that experience in Havana. And initially it was more that I need to go back there and like discover and see and understand more of it, because it was so like still on the surface of what I did get to experience. But like, I don't know, it was just a very, very strong connection for me. Even those 4 days that we were there was like a familiarity with it. There was like a mystery to it, where like I knew and I could see that there was so much more below the surface, but didn't have the time or was not prepared to do that. So kind of more just started with this wanting to find out. But then I kept thinking more about that what I was just describing about like the tourism industry there. And from that, there was a day where I had come home from working at the agency, and I was at home by myself, and I had like all of these like, I don't know, ideas come to me that like weren't really making sense, but I started writing them down. My partner came home and I was like, I need to start a travel company. And then I like told him all of my ideas that were like flowing through me, and he's like, yeah, that's exactly what you should be doing. And I was like, really? Okay. And then I spent like the next few months while I was also working I've always worked in the food industry, or in the restaurant industry since I was like in high school. So I was also working part-time at a restaurant in Ottawa, and then working full-time at this design agency. So within whatever small periods of free time I had, including free time at work at the agency, I was essentially doing like discovery phase of like starting up a new company, a new brand, having no idea like what I was doing or what I was going into. I was fully led by this like opening in me that it felt like a calling. Like, no, you need to like pursue this, whatever it is that this is. You have to listen to it. Mm-hmm. And I did that, and I feel very fortunate that I was very supported by people around me, including my boss at the design agency, once I finally told him what I was up to, when I asked him for time off to go to Cuba in September of that year on a scouting trip. And he was like, yeah, okay, yeah, no, it's exactly what you should be doing. and my bosses too at the restaurant were super supportive. And for the first year of Comuna, after launching it, I then quit the agency, went back to serving and bartending full-time at the restaurant, so that I could essentially bootstrap the beginning of Comuna Travel, mm-hmm. that I had at the time.
Yeah, and you mentioned these scouting missions. What's a typical? I know you've done several since then, but what was like your typical scouting mission at the time? Like you were out looking for these things that were not really, that you wouldn't find in a guidebook, I suppose, or like that, the all-inclusive would not recommend. So where did you find them, and how'd you go about looking for them?
I feel like this is part of what I learned in university was to be a really good researcher. And I've always been really, really good at using the internet and finding information, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. But Instagram also was like my best friend with that. So I started using like the location tags of Havana, specifically with Cuba when I went, and like looking at other people's profiles and then coming across like locals. And then I started following them and reaching out to them, and just basically like cold emailing or cold DMing a lot of people, being like, hey, like I just started this project. I'm coming to Havana or to Cuba to scout and to get to know like the local culture. I really want to focus on the local creative scenes and like really understand what the local reality of that of like the creative spirit and vibrancy of the place is, because that is what I'm interested in connecting the like travel experience to. And I mean, it's no surprise that a lot of people were like, yeah, for sure, like come meet. And so then I set up like a few appointments with or meetups with a couple of people that I had come across in that way. Mm-hmm. Showed up at their doorsteps in Havana, and just had like these moments of like very intimate and friendly interaction where they really connected with what, this like vision of what I wanted to create and do. And I was just like so blown away by what they were doing, to like preserve their culture and enhance it and bring it into like a contemporary reality of their culture. And from there, most people are like, you know what, you should talk to this person. And so it just became basically like immersing myself in the community that I wanted to immerse other people in through a travel experience, and through that created very strong relationships initially.
Yeah, and
from there, and like the communities from these places, and I formed very, very close friendships with a lot of these people, and pretty much every project that I collaborate with.
I know you put a video, like several videos together to sort of like showcase not just Havana, but Cuba. And I know it doesn't give it justice to these like very personal relationships that you have, but I think it's like a really pertinent thing. So I'm going to throw it on now, and maybe we'll take a quick break. So, and then for those who are listening on the podcast, I'll share it in the description so you guys can see it via Comuna's video channel. Wow, does that make you want to travel or what? I'm
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, that's so cool. That's so cool. Yeah, that video is awesome. Yeah, going back to sort of, okay, so you do the scouting. Now that's the first part. You get like the experiences. Now the next part is who do you share these with, and who can you get to come with you on these trips? So how did you go about, like, what was the group size, and how did you find like people who wanted to really experience sort of Cuba the way that you wanted to showcase it?
Yeah, so all of the trips ever since we started doing trips with Comuna have been max, the largest group was 10 people, but I usually max it out at 8 people to keep it very intimate and to be able to maintain the ability to have that like real intimate cross-cultural exchange, so that people aren't like breaking off into little groups, because the experiences that I'm curating are very intimate in like people's homes and studios, and once you have too many people, it becomes more like you're observing rather than like participating in the experience.
Mm-hmm.
But the very first trip was with friends. It was my partner, and it was friends that came, a friend who's a photographer, a friend who's a videographer, Zara, actually, who created that video from a lot of footage that she took on that trip. And they came as though they were coming, and they were like coming on a travel trip as my clients, and paid for it in the same way, so that I could see like how this would work out. Because again, like I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
So it was great to be able to do the first one with people that I already knew who trusted me, and and vice versa. But Instagram definitely was the number one channel of like inbound marketing that I use and that I still use a lot for. So a lot of new travelers who have found Comuna, most of them have been through Instagram. Or afterwards, like someone else has been on a trip and then word of mouth, essentially. And I've done a couple of also collaborative trips, which like through their networks, then someone else found out. But again, still very much focused on Instagram and building the community through that as a platform.
Right. And then like leading on from this, like that the trip worked out, and so then you decided to expand. I know you've added Mexico and Romania. I particularly wanted to talk a bit about Mexico. What made you decide on Mexico specifically?
Everything has just been very not everything that I've done. Like I haven't really premeditated it that far in advance. I've just trusted where this path and this direction has been taking me. But I ended up going to Mexico because one of my best friends, who is a really amazing artist from Ottawa, her name's Whitney Lewis Smith. She has a strong connection to the art scene in Mexico City in particular. So she creates a lot of her art and produces it in Mexico, and would then come back to Ottawa and was constantly back and forth. And when I started Comuna Travel, she was the one that was like, I'm going to Mexico City to work on this big project with this studio there. I really think you should come with me. I really think that like you need to go to Mexico City. And again, I was like, okay, yeah, I'll come. Feels right, I'll come. And I went to Mexico City with her for a week and fell in love with it. And again, it was another moment of the reality of what Mexico City is, which is this incredibly like vibrant, electric, dynamic, contemporary, innovative city. But so much of what now has become very popular in the last 2 to 3 years as a travel destination. But even then, a lot of people's perception on Mexico City, when I told them that that's where I was going to do as like the next destination for Comuna, they were like, "Ooh, like, are you sure? Like, it's it's dangerous there. Like, what do you think people will think? Like, don't you think it'll be hard to like get people to want to travel to Mexico City?" And I saw that as a challenge, like challenge accepted, because that is not what Mexico City is. It has such a much like richer story than that. That is not the only story of Mexico City. And it's actually kind of like a small and like outdated story of it. So that is what drew me to Mexico City first. And then from there, I just developed this very strong connection to Mexico and the diversity of the culture there, its history, and ended up starting to spend a lot more time there myself, doing many more scouting trips outside of Mexico City that brought me to Oaxaca and to several other states throughout Mexico, many of them in very remote areas of Mexico, as I have to thank friends that I made there. Who brought me to these places, to La Sierra Gorda and to San Luis Potosi, and a lot of places that are still very connected to their indigenous cultures and their indigenous roots, where that I became very intrigued by, and I felt it was important to learn more and to become more connected to those cultural roots of Mexico. And yeah, it's just been like a love story ever since then with Mexico in particular.
Yeah, and Oaxaca has the largest percentage of indigenous peoples in Mexico, I think, from all the federal states. And it sort of has like a special place for you. Like, what are like some of the experiences that really like you went on these scouting trips and you're like, oh my God, like I have to share this to others. And what were these things that, did you start noticing some transforming experiences once you had people sort of like experience the same things that you experienced in these communities specifically?
Yeah, so with Oaxaca, I went to Oaxaca for myself as a personal trip because I wanted to go to Oaxaca, but then it also became a scouting. Pretty much like every trip that I take becomes a scouting trip in a way.
Cool.
Yeah, essentially, like if I connect with a place and feel that there's like something very special, which pretty much everywhere in the world is that I've had that experience. I then become very connected with it, and there aren't that many countries in the world actually that I've traveled to, because I continue going back to the same places. I form like very like strong connections with places, and it makes me want to like learn more and become more immersed in it. So I keep returning back. And Mexico has been a place like that. Cuba became that from like my first interaction with it. Romania has been that obviously my entire life. But I ended up in Oaxaca, and it's the state of Mexico with the most amount of indigenous people by population. So that is just, you see it in every part of the culture today. It has preserved its indigenous culture so incredibly well, and it is really it's a sacred place, Oaxaca. You can feel the energy of it because of how deep those cultural indigenous roots remain. And there are so many things that are just part of like people's everyday lives. And Oaxaca in particular is very special because there are so many different dialects of indigenous languages that are still spoken there. I believe like there's around over 50% of the population that don't even speak Spanish. Or English,
like Zapotec or Mixtec. Yeah, they speak other languages.
Yeah, and even within like the Zapotec indigenous language or Mixtec, there are so many dialects in it that you will have like neighboring villages, where villages that are very close proximity to each other, and the dialects are so different that they won't really understand each other.
Mm-hmm.
That's a reality within it. So they've maintained their cultural their connection to those roots very well, and part of it is because of the rugged and remote terrain of Oaxaca. There's the Central Valley where there's Oaxaca City, which is the most popular place for tourism and everything, and it's like the commercial center in the state. But then once you start to go outside of the Central Valley, you're essentially going into mountains. So if you want to get, Oaxaca borders the Pacific Ocean. So if you want to get to the Oaxacan coast, you have to go through the Sierra, the southern mountains to get to the coast. And even in a car today, it is quite the journey. You go through these serpentines through the mountains to get to the coast. And then the Sierra Norte, the northern mountains, again, that's where you have so many indigenous communities that are still very isolated. So
it's super remote. Yeah, and even I think to even get to them, you have to sometimes pass through like drug lord territory. So it also has that level of potential dangerousness to it as well.
It's quite safe.
Okay, well that's good to hear that, because I read that Born to Run book, and they were saying something completely different.
Yeah, but, I guess from my experience, Oaxaca is a very safe state.
That's great.
Yeah.
I did have a specific question, and we're going to touch on the subject a little bit later, but I think it's in one of these trips that you have your sort of first curandera-led experience, like a ceremony. What was it that like for like the first time for you specifically?
Yeah, so I had already started doing, because the trips that I do with Comuna generally are very connected to like local creative cultures, whether that's traditional or contemporary.
Mm-hmm.
And the projects and the people and businesses and everything that I collaborate with, the one thing is like determining factor to collaborate with them is that what they're doing is in some way preserving or enhancing their culture. And it can be like farmers or chefs or artists or musicians, or record labels, whatever. It's somehow, I then create these like little bridges between these different creative communities to show like a more like well-rounded more rounded reality of what the contemporary culture is like and how these people are using, you know, their ancestral culture to enhance that and to lift it and to preserve it and like move forward for the current reality that we're living in. So Oaxaca, I did that with Oaxaca as well. It became like an add-on trip during Dia de los Muertos at the end of Day of the Dead at the end of October in Mexico, an add-on trip to a Mexico City trip that I was already doing. And a friend of mine, Sarah, very good friend of mine, Sarah, who I know from Ottawa. We worked at the restaurant that I was working at when I started Comuna together. And it was sort of like her side job as well. And she's a natural healthcare practitioner. And through, you know, like the web of communities and connections and everything, so her mentor, essentially, who has deep roots to Oaxaca, and her name's Madeline, and who had led an experience with people from Canada to Oaxaca, specifically very focused on like spirituality, traditional medicine, reached out to Sarah and said, look, like this is not what I do as a living, but it's an experience that is very profound. And I would like for, you know, this relationship that has been started to continue evolving, but I can't do it. She's a little bit older. I think she had just had hip surgery as well, and realized that it's a lot of work to be bringing people on travel experiences and guiding that, so to speak. And so she contacted Sarah and asked Sarah if Sarah would like to basically like take it over. And then Sarah contacted me and said, was this something that you'd be interested in doing? I know it's a little bit different from the types of trips that you create, but if it is something that you're interested in, let me know. And it's, again, like synchronicity. Exactly the day that she called me, I was at a cottage with girlfriends, and I hadn't seen them in a long time because I was traveling so much back and forth. So I was like telling them about my most recent experiences in Mexico. I had done this really big, like 3-week trip throughout several states, a lot of it in different indigenous areas and lands of Mexico. And I was telling them how I really wanted to spend a lot more time connecting with these communities and learning from them, and maybe not even find a way to incorporate these communities in the trips and like in a very sustainable tourism regenerative way. And that day, as I'm having this conversation with my friend, Sarah calls me to ask me this, if I want to partner with her to do a spiritual retreat to Oaxaca connected to the indigenous communities and indigenous traditional medicine and curanderas, healers that are primarily women in Oaxaca. And in that moment, I was like, yeah, I don't even need to hear more because this is like way too synchronous to even question what is going on here. Like, are you serious? So that is how I became connected to that. And so after I said yes to this adventure, I already had a trip planned at the end of that year. I'm like losing track of what year we're in.
I think we're 2019. Yeah, I was about to say 2019. Yeah.
That was 2019 to Mexico City with an add-on to Oaxaca during the time of Dia de los Muertos. And I said to Sarah, well, why don't you come with me to Mexico? Like meet me in Oaxaca and we will go and do it like how I do this. I experience it all ourselves first and connect with these communities, become immersed in them, learn from them, create a report, and then from there we can decide if it feels right from both ends for us to do this retreat, which was then supposed to be in February of 2020, which it was. And we went, Sarah met me in Mexico, and we went to Oaxaca. And so our connection to these communities in Oaxaca is through a company called Tierra Sagrada and Tierra Ventura. and it's founded by Claudia Schur and her husband Eve, and they have been settled in Oaxaca for the past 23 years, I believe. She's German and he's Swiss, and they started a company called Tierra Ventura, an ecotourism company in Oaxaca, and they became very connected to indigenous communities of Oaxaca through what they were doing as ecotourism. And so they are the ones that were our guides and our bridge into these communities and into the world of traditional indigenous medicine. And through that, the women who are leading it for the most part are the elders of these communities, and many of them are curanderas.
And so it's like, it's so unfortunate that, you know, you do this scouting mission in early 2020 and then the pandemic hits. But instead of just like being like, oh,
retreat in early 2020. So we did the scouting one at the end of 2019, and then we did the first retreat in February.
You did the first retreat, yeah. And then I think you, so before the pandemic had, I think you had another one planned again in the same region, if I'm correct. And then sort of the pandemic hits. But instead of like, you know, just like putting the whole thing on hold, you actually decide to sort of, you know, migrate to, I think what you call the Comuna Project. Yeah. And you begin organizing online sessions. And you know, I call them because I got to meet them, and I call them the ceremonial dream team. But you have you have Sarah, you have Claudia, and then you have these curanderas like Lorena and Sonia and others. And it's like you had everything there, and now you just had to do the research of like the platforms and stuff. I have so many questions, but like the first one is, what made you think, hey, you know what, these healing ceremonies, if I bring them online and sort of do something, this might actually be, there might be something there.
Yeah, it wasn't something that came up instantly, but
yeah.
The retreat, and it was so profound and incredible. In February 2020, and then came home and there was a global pandemic and everything changed. This was supposed to be, 2020 was supposed to be the year that I added more countries and more travel and more experiences and everything, and it fully shut down the entire project, the entire company. And I kind of just, I listened to that, and I decided from the beginning that, you know what, I'm gonna honor what this is, this great cause. There's clearly like a calling from the world, from, you know, the universe, that we need to slow down and we need to take a moment to really listen to like what is going on in the world and how we're showing up in it, in the reality of our relationship to the environment and everything. So I canceled everything immediately, all of the trips that were planned for the rest of 2020 without you know, at first everyone was saying it'll be a few weeks, or it'll be 4 weeks, it'll be just a couple months. But I just had this like intuitive knowing that wasn't real, that this was going to be our reality for a while. So I canceled everything for 2020 and just had this mindset of slowing down and grounding into home and listening, and kind of like taking stock of everything that I had done up until this point, everything that I had learned, these amazing communities that had opened up so much of their homes and their culture and their projects to me and to other people who I brought on the trips up until then. And I spent a few months last summer just kind of not doing anything other than, you know, meditating, doing a lot of like inner work, because I couldn't work really.
Right.
And in that, this experience that we had on retreat in February in Oaxaca remained as like a grounding, as like a grounding anchor throughout the last year, because of what was introduced to us, what the conversations that we had, this like very extremely profound and potent experience was what I kept going back to in moments when the reality of what this past year has been became very difficult. And in that, Sarah and Claudia and I have maintained contact. I maintain contact with most of the people that I work with as much as I can. But in that kind of a conversation of, do you think we could do this as this is many months later, like in August sort of 2020, had this conversation of, do you think we could do this in like some sort of virtual setting, more so for us to like remain connected with each other and to like continue building community in some way? That's been like a big focus for me since the pandemic hit of, okay, well, I can't do the travel trips, what can I do? And it's been very focused on continuing to try and build community in different ways, however I can, and focusing on what I can control and the very small pockets of places where I can do something, rather than looking at it from what I was used to from like a very global perspective. It became a lot more local.
Mm-hmm.
In that conversation, we said, let's just try and see what happens, because what do you have to lose anyways? And we kind of, you know, had an idea, planned it out. Claudia and Eve recorded these amazing videos from Oaxaca, from their environment. And we offered it, we put it online. It sold out within, like, it was fully booked within a few days. And it was, you know, kind of like a message that, okay, well, it's clear that what people need right now, you can't travel, and it's not a good idea to travel right now. But what people need is connection, and they need community, and they need tools to help them stay grounded and to be able to thrive and to do their best where they can to get through a lot of the difficulty that we're all experiencing on very different levels right now. And with that, it then helps you like kind of go inward a little bit to see, okay, where am I struggling a little bit? What can I do to like help myself? And then in that, how can I now support my community, because I'm coming from a very grounded place. So a lot of the focus of these online sessions that we created for the Ceremonia sessions has been to introduce people to the indigenous knowledge of Oaxaca through traditional medicine and traditional wisdom and healing modalities that are very simple, but they're all sort of connected to reconnecting to our environment, reconnecting to ourselves, and looking at like the healing process as an inward journey that then reflects in the outward. I think it's so much in the world, we're trying to, and we're so bombarded with like information and everything that you can see why this is the case, but we're trying to change and sort of like fix things outside of ourselves. We're trying to fix the environment. We're trying to fix our political systems, our institutions, you know, everything is out there, and that's the problem. And even within my communities and a lot of the conversations that we've been having this year, but until we start to look inside of ourselves first and heal ourselves individually and listen to our emotions, listen to, you know, the discomforts that life is creating for us, it's going to be very difficult for all of the things that we're doing to try to make the world a better place, for them to be able to actually like land or stick anywhere or influence anyone, unless you're doing the work yourself. You know, everything, we're a microcosm of the macrocosm. And there's the very old ancient quote by Hermes of as above, so below, as within, so without, as a universe, so the soul. And that is a very, very universal knowing of a lot of indigenous and ancient wisdom, that if you want the future to not be what it is right now, you have to start with yourself. Then it kind of ripples out into your circle of people around you, then that ripples out into your community, and then that ripple will eventually become a wave that will change, that will create the change that you would like to see in the world.
Yeah.
Gandhi said.
That's good. You got all your quotes out for that.
Yeah.
But they are good ones. And I think, you know, I've, you know, full disclosure to the people listening, I've been in 2 of these sessions already. And that second session really, you know, Sarah had done a guided meditation, and then it was followed by a ceremony that was, you know, led by Lorena and Claudia, who was there to translate. And it was, some of these personal touches you added were just like, it really dwelled this, you made a care package. I don't know if people can see right now, but like it has like, this little handwritten note, and like, there's like a little post-it, there's like beeswax, I think there's like flowers from your dad's garden in Romania. I mean, like, how did you go about thinking about this, and that actually, adding these things could really, really help people opening it up, and not even that, just healing over, a Zoom meeting, which is not something you hear every day. And I felt it, and it's quite powerful.
That's amazing to hear. I've also been feeling and experiencing it myself, facilitating it alongside Sarah and Claudia and Lorena. And it's been, for all of us, it's been a very amazing, beautiful surprise to see that you can move energy through a screen, through technology in this way, and that you can create community in this way, and that you can like really connect emotionally and intimately like this. But the box, which is what you're really asking about, when we were like, okay, how do we do this, and how do we make it special and not just someone staring at a Zoom screen, observing instruction. And so part of it was, well, it's important to like bring people into the environment so that they can get a sense of what Oaxaca is like, the terrain, the environment, the mountains, the flora, which became a part of the videos that were recorded beforehand. And we decided to create this ceremony because the focus is on ceremony, creating ceremony into your daily life and ritual into your daily life, as a very simple but powerful tool to stay grounded and connected to yourself and your environment, wherever it is that you find yourself right now. And so we decided to make the ceremony bundle that you just showed. And that we also wanted to emphasize that you don't need to travel somewhere super far away to Mexico or to Peru or whatever to have these very like transformative experiences. You can also you can do that in your everyday life, and you also don't have to kind of like give in to what the wellness industry is really like selling, that like you need to use sage and this and that. And so a lot of the box is created in a sense of like what is from like our current environment. So Sarah spends time on a regenerative farm in Ottawa, where she is cultivating and learning regenerative farming practices. So a lot of the items in like this, actually I have it here, in like the smoke stick, it's like cedar from her backyard. It's sage. It's not white sage. It's sage that are from her garden. Nice. And so everything it's like this physical reminder to people that wherever you are is sacred, and to create a connection with the things that you were incorporating into your life and ritual and ceremony. But it was also a way to connect everyone. Everyone that is participating in sessions receives the box.
Yeah.
They receive the same thing. And so we encourage them to use it as a way to like connect with what it is that they're being shown over Zoom during our ceremonia sessions together. Like everyone receives a red protective bracelet, which is used in many cultures around the world, in Kabbalah and in Eastern Orthodox religion. It's a way of like protecting from the evil eye. If you're working with like your own energy and like becoming more open, then it's a way to like protect yourself from a lot of these cultural beliefs. And it's also a way to connect everyone. Like when I look at this, I think of every single person that is doing this 4-week virtual ceremony with me, and you're wearing it too.
I'm wearing mine. Yeah, of course. I put it on as soon as I got it in the mail. And it was nice to receive also something from Sarah that I actually had never met before, and it was like super personal. And now I'm gonna sound super North American, but the smell that comes from these herbs is just absolutely phenomenal. I hope it's okay. I'm gonna light mine up and partake here. I hope that's cool with you.
Yes. I lit mine earlier at the beginning of
okay.
of the podcast too. clear the air.
I mean, it does have like a very like, healing, it makes you feel good and calm and centered. And, it has, like, I think people just like, we've thought to not think about it for so long that like we've kind of forgot about it, but it really does have a power on us, and it makes us feel better and more connected. And I'm really glad that, you've made me like, you're teaching us about this, and it's so cool. It's really cool.
I'm really glad that you think that. And I've been having a great experience in the ceremonia session. Yeah.
I know like one of the tools that you use for these sessions is called community. What's your take on it so far? And on that question as well, because we're dwindling down towards the end of the podcast here. But what tools do you think you would recommend for other people or other entrepreneurs that kind of want to do something similar to Comuna?
So I think the tool that you're referring to is the community space.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's a platform called Mighty Network, and it's a platform where you can build out your own community within their platform.
Mm-hmm.
So So it is something that's new, this transition from Comuna Travel to the Comuna Project, but it's also something that I've been thinking about for a long time. I just never had any time. Going from one place and leaving another trip to like fully focus on it. But
right.
A big part of it is also making cultural exchange more accessible to more people. I always knew from the beginning that it wasn't really about travel. It was more about creating experiences where people can open up and step outside of their comfort zones, and also have the ability and the space to interact with other cultures in a very intimate way, and actually have that exchange happening that leads to inspiration, leads to a relationship, leads to, further something longer and like change down the road. But I also always knew that travel is it's a privilege. It's such a privilege. It's a great privilege to be able to travel and have these experiences, but it's only available to a very small amount of people for whatever reasons. A lot of it financial, a lot of it time constraint.
Mm-hmm.
And a year before the pandemic hit, I kept having this thought process happening within as I was growing the travel experiences, that I would like to create more of a digital platform to create more of these offerings online, and hopefully it lead to more of a focus on education, and hopefully involve youth cultural exchange opportunities as well. Mm-hmm. So the community space is kind of like the beginning of that, as a result of this pandemic and the time that it has allowed. Because of it, I finally have the time to actually start focusing on that a little bit more, and it's something that I'm actually very excited about being able to grow. It's starting with the ceremonia sessions, but I would like to do more things with it. I think there's a really great opportunity in that, and in using technology in a positive way to continue connecting people. Mm-hmm. And as I'm seeing and you're experiencing. And we're learning that you can use it in a way that still feels intimate and still feels personal and is immersive.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more. Like on the immersiveness, I was like genuinely very surprised, and especially after so many months of being just online meetings, online conferences, and everything. This was a very personal thing, and also hearing some of the participants open up and just feeling safe in doing that. It was it reminded me of some of the first group meditations I've ever done in real, with people around me. But this was all via computer screen. It's really cool. I have just one more question, but I'm really glad and really happy to hear that this online community is something that you're going to continue to work on. But my last question is, once this pandemic is over, are you going to return to the sort of travel part of Comuna, and if so, what do you think is going to be the next destination?
Good question. Yeah, well, obviously nobody knows what the future is. I think that travel will open up, and it'll open up in a different way. Before I answer that question, I didn't really like fully answer your question about the tools. I think
Oh, right. Sorry. Yes.
you need to continue to look at technology ways that you can amplify it, and see how you can like make the most of it and think of it outside the box of what it's, like we're using Zoom for these virtual sessions, but we're also using like videos recorded in Oaxaca to bring people into like a more immersive state and things like that. And like these boxes are a way to connect people in a different way of like kind of connecting like technology with more like tangible things within, if you're trying to do like more experience-based stuff to connect people. And another aspect of just in travel as well, it's not really a tool, but a mindset, would be to always have an open mind and always be humble in that you don't know everything. I think that in the travel industry, especially, and especially like with very like traditional, it's a very like outdated industry, and in most parts, or has been up until now, where people kind of think that like they know everything about a culture when they're bringing and guiding people into it. And I would say that my biggest advice that I hope people would take into consideration is to remember that you don't know everything, and that there's always something more to learn, and that what we know or we think we know about people or cultures and different realities around the world is still very small, and we still have so much that we can learn from each other if we keep an open mind. I'm still learning. Like there's such a little fraction of what I know of all these places, including my own culture. I'm still, even when I went back to Romania now, like I still am blown away by how much I don't know. And it's always a good reminder of that. With travel particularly, yes, Comuna Travel will remain as a company underneath the Comuna Project. Evolving in this way, I think, is just allowing more space for more things to evolve. And digital platform is one of them, and doing immersive virtual cultural exchange experiences. But I'd also like to incorporate events when we can gather in person again, and like facilitation workshops, things closer to home in Canada, in Montreal. And I would love to connect when they open up again, because a lot of these communities are closed off in BC, but with Indigenous communities in BC and young entrepreneurs and networks within Canada that are doing really amazing things in Indigenous tourism and sustainability and regenerative practices. And by kind of creating a larger umbrella as the Comuna Project, I hope to be able to bring more collaboration together to do community building across cultures and communities.
That's awesome. Ioana, thank you so much for coming on the pod. It was so great to hear everything you had to say and share. And I guess the best way for people to learn a bit more is to go on your website. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can go to comunaproject.com, and you can check us out on Instagram at the Comuna Project. You can also follow me on Instagram, Ioana.Todosia. I love connecting with people and hearing from anyone.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for bringing such a sense of community and connectivity in this age where we really need it. I know I appreciate it personally, and I hope others will get to experience it the same way I have so far, or in a different way, but also good for themselves. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Phil.
All right. Take care.